The night air was cold, a clean, sharp cold that hit my face as I stumbled out of the car. It was supposed to be a simple family dinner, but it became my execution. I can still hear the sharp thud of the folded stack of bills dropping onto the plate and the clatter of the silverware. Then my wife's voice, not a shout, but a low cutting sound like a blade through the noise. "You can't even pay the mortgage," she had said. The folded stack of past due notices, the red ink screaming what I already knew, spread across the table like a public accusation. My stomach clenched. I could feel the blood drain from my face. Her brother Mark just smirked. "Well, maybe if you spent less time chasing dead-end ideas and more time working a real job, you wouldn't be in this mess." The laughter that followed was soft, almost polite, but it burned. My father-in-law cleared his throat, shaking his head as if I was a disappointment he could no longer defend. But the worst, my own father. He was there, sitting at the end of the table. He said nothing. He just looked down at his plate. That silence. It hurt more than any words. It was his agreement with them. I remember my daughter's fork slipping from her hand, clattering against the plate. She looked at me, not angry, not mocking, just confused, terrified. She saw her father sitting there, letting himself be torn apart. I wanted to shout, to tell them I was fighting, trying. But I couldn't. The truth was, I had failed them. So I stood up. My chair scraped against the floor louder than I expected. I muttered something, maybe an apology, maybe an excuse, I don't even remember. Then I turned my back and walked out, now leaning against the cold wall outside, pressing my hand against my chest as if I could hold myself together. I replayed her words again and again. "You can't even pay the mortgage." She was right, and that was the worst part. But the humiliation, it didn't start here. It had been with me my entire life. My real wound was carved long ago back on the broken soil of our family farm. The farm was collapsing slowly, season by season. The barn roof was leaking, the cattle were thin. Neighbors whispered that my father had lost his touch. But every failure, every broken fence, every withered crop was laid at my feet. If a fence broke, it was my fault. If the crops withered, it was because I didn't work hard enough. My father never missed a chance to remind me. And worse, he always reminded me in front of others. He used public shame as a way to unburden his own deep sense of failure. I still remember that other Sunday dinner, the one that snapped everything into pieces. The table was crowded with relatives, the smell of roasted chicken filling the air. I was 17, a big but awkward teenager. My father, red-faced from drink, slammed his fist down on the table. The dishes rattled, and that sound, it's etched into my memory. "This boy is the reason the farm's dying," he roared. "Lazy, useless, he's just the shadow of Miles." Miles was my cousin who had left the rural town for the city and become a lawyer. Miles was the standard. I was the failed comparison. His words cut deeper than any blade. My uncles laughed under their breath, my cousins smirked. And my mother, she just stared at her plate, too afraid to defend me. My mother's silence was my first lesson in abandonment. I sat frozen, my cheeks burning as if the fire from the hearth had leapt into me. The humiliation didn't stop there. The next morning at the local market, a neighbour nudged another, saying loud enough for me to hear, "That's the boy who couldn't keep his father's farm alive. Just like his old man, failure upon failure." Their chuckles followed me like shadows. I clenched my fists, my nails digging into my palms. I was already broken inside. The fights at home grew worse. My father's disappointment turned to rage, and his rage turned to insults. "You'll never amount to anything. You're not a real man. You're a liability." Words like that, they don't fade. They echo for years, replaying when I tried to sleep, when I looked in the mirror, when I dared to dream. I tried to work harder, waking before dawn, working until my body gave out. I wanted to prove him wrong, but no matter what I did, it was never enough. My father wasn't looking for help. He was looking for someone to blame. My mother's silence grew heavier, her eyes avoiding mine, as if she too had given up on me. Then came the breaking point. A terrible storm rolled in, tearing through the fields, flattening what little crop we had left. A natural disaster became a personal tragedy. That night I stood in the mud, holding a broken tool. My father turned on me, shouting so loud the neighbours gathered by the fence. "You cursed this farm. You're a disgrace. Everything you touch turns to dust." He shoved me hard enough that I stumbled, falling face first into the cold mud. In that moment, with the rain mixing with my tears and the mud on my tongue, I knew there was no place left for me there. That was the night I left. I walked away with the firm belief that I deserved it. Leaving wasn't a choice. It was survival. I packed a small bag, leaving behind my old truck and the family name that had brought me so much shame. I walked down the long dirt road without looking back. The rain was still falling, but the storm inside me was louder. With every step sinking into the soaked earth, I felt myself walking away, not just from a farm, but from my identity. I was trying to erase the old me. I thought my mother would stop me. She would call out, beg me to stay. She didn't. She stood by the window, her face pale in the dim light, gripping the lace curtain. Her lips moved. I thought she might have said, "Don't go," but no words came out loud enough for me to hear. That silence, it hurt more than my father's rage. Silence was permission. Silence was abandonment. The city was colder than I expected, not because of the weather, but because no one cared who I was. I was just another stranger trying to make rent, trying to hide the accent that tied me to a dying farm. I found a small, damp room that smelled of old coffee and loneliness, where I could hide from the world. I took jobs that broke my back, washing dishes, hauling crates, sweeping floors. I worked nights, I worked holidays. Every night I lay on a mattress in a cramped room, wondering if I had really escaped, or if I was just running in place. Calls from home were rare. When the phone did ring, it was never my father. Once my mother's voice slipped through, trembling. She asked if I was eating enough, sleeping enough, and then just as quickly she hung up. "No, come home. No, we miss you." Just fragments of care swallowed by fear. Years passed and I drifted. The separation wasn't just physical, it was a slow death of connection. I wasn't part of them anymore, and they weren't part of me. However, the real crushing divorce came later in my own home. The morning after that humiliating dinner, my wife found me on the steps. She didn't yell this time, she didn't even look at me. She just said, flat and cold, "I can't live like this anymore." And then she walked past me into the house. I slept in the car that night. The morning after, she stood in the kitchen and simply said, "I want a divorce." Just like that. No shouting, no tears, just 4 words, flat and final, dropped onto the table like a death sentence. She slid a folded piece of paper across the table, her list of what needed to be divided: custody of the kids, the mortgage. It was a premeditated plan. My daughter started to cry. My son stared at me, waiting for me to fight back, to say something. But I couldn't. I had lost my voice, lost my strength. I packed my things. I remember carrying boxes out to the car while the kids stood in the doorway. My son clenched his fists, holding himself back from asking me not to go. My daughter hid behind him, tears streaming down her face. I wanted to tell them it wasn't the end, but the words felt hollow. I kissed their foreheads one by one and walked away. I only said, "I love you." That was all I had left. That was the separation, not just from my wife, not just from the house, but from myself. I had become what my father called me: a failure, a runaway. Life in the city was supposed to be my fresh start, my great escape, but instead it became my undoing, a downward spiral more enduring than the farm's collapse. I scrubbed restaurant floors until my knees bled, carried crates until my shoulders felt like tearing apart. I told myself this was temporary, that I was building towards something. But months stretched into years and nothing changed. Everywhere I turned, I met closed doors. I was stuck in the tiny apartment, the one with the stained carpet and the smell of damp clinging to everything. Every door I knocked on stayed shut. When people asked about my background, I froze. What could I say? That I had fled a dying farm, branded a failure by my own father. The shame in my voice betrayed me. I started inventing stories, tales of successful, non-existent jobs. The lies only made me feel worse. Friends came and went. At first I shared apartments, but slowly they moved on, better jobs, better lives. I stayed behind, stuck in the same dim rooms, chasing bills I could barely pay. Loneliness has a sound. It's the hum of the refrigerator at midnight, the echo of footsteps in a hallway. No one walks anymore. It's the silence of a phone that never rings. I used to think my father's insults were the cruelest thing I'd ever endure. I was wrong. Loneliness whispers in your own voice, telling you he was right. You are useless. I drank more than I should have. A beer after work became bottles lining my floor. The alcohol softened the edges, blurred the memories. But it also sharpened the truth I was wasting away. My body grew thinner, my eyes hollow. I stopped shaving, stopped showering regularly. I wanted to disappear, and I was facilitating the process. I couldn't bear to see what I was becoming. The lowest point came when I lost my job at the warehouse. "You're not reliable anymore," the manager said, his face half pity, half irritation. "We need someone who can show up sober. You fell asleep on the line." That word sober rang in my ears like a verdict. I walked out with an empty cardboard box of my things, empty just like me. That night I sat on the edge of my bed, staring at the floor. I thought about calling home, calling my ex-wife, but the weight of humiliation held me back. What would I say? That my father was right all along. And the worst part was, I agreed with him. Depression is heavy. Getting up felt like lifting mountains. Every movement was a struggle. I started missing visits with the kids. Not because I didn't want to see them, but because I couldn't bear the shame of showing up empty-handed. What kind of father brings his children to a bare apartment with nothing but pasta and tap water? So I made excuses. I told my wife I was sick or working. She didn't question it. Her silence was acceptance. You failed again. Each missed visit widened the distance. I hit rock bottom one rainy night. The bottle was nearly empty when I stumbled to the window. For a moment I thought about ending it, stepping out of that window and letting the world take me once and for all. The thought terrified me, but what terrified me more was how calm it felt, how easy. It felt like a merciful, permanent silence. I only pulled back when I saw the photo of my kids on the dresser. Their faces stared at me, innocent, trusting. I collapsed on the bed and wept like a child. The next morning I looked in the mirror. Bloodshot eyes, pale face, thick stubble. I was a ghost. I was hollow. I had become a hollow shell, drowning in regret. I had given up on being a husband, a father, a man. And yet in the middle of that darkness, something unexpected was waiting to pull me back toward life. It was a Saturday afternoon when I was trying to shake off a hangover that I heard the knock on the door. It wasn't the landlord or a bill collector. It was softer, hesitant, but persistent. I almost didn't answer. When I opened the door, my son Liam was standing there. He looked taller than I remembered, older somehow. His backpack was slung over one shoulder. I stammered, "What are you doing here? Does your mother know?" He cut me off, his voice firm. "She thinks I'm at a friend's working on a project." I stood frozen in the doorway. The apartment was a mess. Dishes piled in the sink, empty bottles on the counter. The air smelled of stale whiskey and damp carpet. I watched his eyes scan the room, and shame burned in my chest. This feeling was worse than my father's humiliation. "This is where you live now?" he asked quietly. The tone was not accusatory, it was just painful plain truth. I nodded, unable to meet his gaze. "It's temporary." He didn't say anything. He just dropped his backpack and sat down at the small chipped table I'd found in a thrift store. He wasn't looking at the mess. He was looking at me. We sat there in silence for a while. The wheezing of the old fridge was the only sound. Finally, he broke the silence. "Dad, why don't you come home? I know you and Mum fight, but why don't you try?" The question hit me like a punch. It was the question I had been running from for months. I swallowed hard, trying to find an answer that wouldn't break him. "Your mum and I, we can't live together anymore. It's complicated." He shook his head, his eyes welling up. "I don't care about complicated." His voice cracked. "I don't care about the money. I don't care about the house. I just don't want you to leave us." The words lodged in my chest. I wanted to tell him I hadn't left, but in that moment I realized the truth. I had abandoned them. With every missed visit, every unanswered call, every lie I told to hide my shame, I had abandoned them. "I'm sorry," I whispered, but the words weren't enough. He wiped his face with the back of his hand. "You don't have to be perfect, Dad. You just have to be here." Something broke inside me then, not the old fracture of humiliation, but a breaking that let the light in. His words were the hammer that shattered the wall of my despair. We spent the rest of the afternoon together. I cooked pasta, the only thing I knew how to make, and he laughed. We ate at the chipped table, and for the first time in months I laughed for real. Before he left, he reached into his backpack and pulled out a photo. Him, his sister and me taken years ago at the park. "Keep it," he said, "so you don't forget who you are, so you don't forget we need you." After he left, I sat there for a long time holding the photo. I stared at our smiles, and I made a decision. I couldn't keep living like this, not for me, but for them. I had been waiting for someone to save me, but maybe what I needed was to save myself. I had to rebuild. The morning after my son's visit, I woke up before sunrise. For the first time in months, I had a reason to get up. There was a sliver of sunlight on the floor. I stood in the kitchen staring at the mess I had let pile up. Dirty dishes, empty bottles, piles of laundry. It was a mirror of the man I had become. But his words echoed. "You just have to be here." So I started small. I washed the dishes, scrubbing until they shone, using my fingernails to clean the crusted food. I opened the curtains for the first time. I opened the windows, letting the stale, heavy air escape, letting the sunlight pour in. I bagged up the bottles, the trash, the pieces of failure I had surrounded myself with. The cleaning took the whole morning, and it was more exhausting than any physical labor. It didn't fix everything, but when I stepped back, the apartment looked different, cleaner, brighter. Maybe it could hold something more than regret, and maybe so could I. I started finding odd jobs, fixing fences, painting houses, hauling boxes, anything that paid. At first it felt humiliating, but when I came home sore and tired, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time: purpose. Each dollar wasn't just money, it was proof that I was trying, proof that I wasn't useless as my father had said. I sent a portion of the money to my ex-wife for the kids' expenses. It was a small amount, but it was a beginning. The kids noticed. One Saturday, my son looked at me and said, "You're different, Dad. You look better." I asked him what he meant. He shrugged, but his smile gave it away. "You don't look so sad anymore. You don't smell like beer." It nearly broke me, but this time with quiet emotion. Because he was right. I started picking them up more often. Not just on weekends. Sometimes we'd walk in the park. Sometimes just sit together in the small apartment, watching old movies, eating cheap pizza. I listened more. I stopped trying to prove myself. I realized something. Being a father wasn't about having all the answers or having a big house. It was about being present enough to hear the questions. One evening, as my daughter was drawing at the table, she said, "I like it here." I glanced around at the small apartment, the peeling paint. "Here?" I asked. She nodded. "Because you smile more here. I feel like you're really here." That night I let those words sink into me. It didn't matter where I lived or how little I had. What mattered was what they saw when they looked at me. I started reaching out beyond them too. I called my father for the first time in months. My voice was shaky, but I said, "I'm doing well. I'm building things back." I wasn't asking for anything, just giving an update. A few days later, a plain envelope slipped under my door. The handwriting was my mother's, trembling. Inside were only a few lines. "Your father is sick. The farm is dying. If you can come home just once." I stared at the letter. My chest tightened, my throat burned. The truth was there in black ink. I was still their son, and they were still my family. I drove all night, back to the farm, back to the place that had ruined me. But this time, I didn't return as a runaway child. I returned as a man who had started rebuilding himself. When I stepped off at the small rural station, the air hit me like a ghost, thick with the smell of soil, hay and rain. The same air I had once hated now felt like home and exile all at once. I walked the dirt road toward the farm. The house came into view, smaller than I remembered, the paint peeling, the porch sagging. My mother stood on the porch. Her hair was greyer, her shoulders thinner, but her eyes were the same. She just nodded as if to say, "You came." Inside I found my father. He was thinner too. His once broad shoulders hunched, his breath shallow. This was not the man who had towered over me. He looked at me for a long time, his eyes searching my face. Finally, he rasped out the words I had never expected to hear. "You came back." That was it. No apology, no explanation, just those 3 words. But in them I heard something else needed. The days that followed were awkward, silent at first. But the farm itself forced us together. A barn door needed fixing, the fields needed clearing. My father couldn't do it alone, and neither could I. So we worked side by side the way we never had before. The first time we lifted a beam together, our hands brushed, and he didn't pull away. The first time he gave me instructions, his voice wasn't sharp. It was tired but steady. Rebuilding a farm isn't just about fixing fences or planting seeds. It's about sweat patience and starting over in a place that remembers everything you've lost. For the first time, I wasn't running from it. I was facing it with my father beside me. We started small. The barn roof had been sagging for years. I climbed up with a hammer. My father stood below, his voice guiding me. "Lay the plank flat, nail it clean, don't rush it." The same man who once barked insults now offered quiet instructions, almost gentle. The fields were next. We cleared patches of weeds, turned the soil, planted rows of corn and beans. My muscles screamed, blisters formed, but this time it didn't feel like punishment. It felt like progress. At the end of each day, my shirt clung to me with sweat and dust, and I'd glance at my father. He always noticed. Sometimes it was just a nod, sometimes the faintest smile. It was enough. We ate meals together again. At first, silence filled the table, but slowly conversation returned. He'd ask how the fields looked. I'd tell him about a stubborn patch of weeds, and sometimes, rarely, he'd laugh. My mother would watch as her eyes wet, as if she was afraid that speaking would break the fragile peace we were building. One evening, as the sun bled red across the horizon, I sat on the porch steps, exhausted. My father lowered himself beside me. "It's coming back," he murmured. I didn't know if he meant the farm or us. Maybe both, I thought. For the first time in years, I let myself believe that we could grow again, not just crops, but forgiveness. The day finally came. After a long day in the fields, he sat across from me, his hands trembling as he sat down his fork. He looked at me with eyes I barely recognized, soft and weary. "I was wrong, son," he said, his voice raw. He continued, his gaze dropping to the table. "I thought I had to make you tough. I thought breaking you was the only way you'd survive. But all I did was push you away. I stole your youth with fear." His voice cracked, and for the first time in my life I saw tears fill my father's eyes. Something inside me cracked too. All the years of anger, humiliation, loneliness, they collided in that moment. "You hurt me, Dad." I forced the words out. "You made me believe I was worthless. I left because I couldn't bear it anymore." He nodded, his jaw trembling. "I know. And I'll never forgive myself for it. I'm sorry." Then slowly I reached across the table. My hand covered his. His skin was rough, calloused, but his grip tightened around mine. No more words were needed. We had finally seen each other. My mother, who had been silent all this time, let out a sob and covered her face. That night, something shifted. The walls we had built came down brick by brick. My healing with my ex-wife and children also progressed. One evening, when I dropped the kids off, she lingered at the door. "You look different," she said. "You stopped destroying yourself. I see that." "I'm trying," I replied. "For them." She invited me inside just for coffee. We sat at the kitchen table, the very one where she had humiliated me. "I was angry," she admitted. "I felt like you had given up. I felt I was carrying everything alone, and I hurt you so you would feel that pain too." She was right. "I did give up," I said quietly. "And I'm sorry for all of it, for letting you down when you needed me most." The silence that followed wasn't sharp anymore. It was soft, like a blanket pulled over something fragile. Weeks passed and she let me stay for dinner. The kids beamed when I sat at the table. We were laughing again, awkwardly, carefully, but laughter nonetheless. One evening as I was leaving, she stopped me at the door. "You're not the same man you were before," she said. She smiled faintly. "You're better." The day of reunion wasn't marked by any grand event. It was simple, ordinary, yet it was everything we had lost and finally regained. It was Christmas Eve. I drove back to the farm. Snow was falling gently, covering everything in a clean white blanket. Inside the old house, the scent of fresh pine and baking bread was thick. My mother moved between the stove and the table with a quiet hum. My father sat at the head of the table, frail, but his posture was proud. He looked at me not with judgment, but with something far rarer, peace and acceptance. I arrived with the children. My ex-wife came too as a friend and honoured guest. We ate together. No sharp silence, no tension heavy in the air. My father told an old story about fixing a tractor in the dead of winter. I added my own memories, and they were met with nods, smiles, and belonging. Halfway through the meal, I realized my hands weren't clenched. My shoulders weren't tight. I wasn't bracing for a blow that never came. I was simply there, a son eating with his parents, and it was enough. When the meal was done, we cleared the table together. My daughter shoved a dish towel into my hands and said, "Dad, you dry." I laughed. I actually laughed. We stood by the sink drying plates while my son washed and my wife wiped down the counters. It was such a small thing, but it felt monumental, like the family we had been was slowly piecing itself back together. Later we stepped outside. Snow was still falling. My father rested his hand on my shoulder. His grip was weak but steady. "This farm will outlive me," he said quietly, looking out at the snow-covered fields. "But I hope it never outlives what we found again." I swallowed hard. "It won't, Dad," I told him. "Not this time. We'll hold on to it together." My mother slipped her arm around both of us, and for the first time in my memory we stood together, united whole. The farm had been a battlefield, but now I saw it as the place we were rebuilt. And in that moment, I knew we were home. In the city house, the healing was also cemented. One Sunday night, my ex-wife invited me to stay for dinner, not just as a guest, but as part of the family. My son Liam raised his glass of soda and said, "To us." We all clinked glasses. My wife met my eyes, and for the first time in a long time, I didn't see anger or disappointment there. I saw acceptance, respect, a love that had transformed. We didn't remarry. We are friends, partners in parenting. But I know this, we are no longer broken. We built a new table, a new family on the foundation of truth and forgiveness. And being together is enough. That night, as I walked back to my apartment, I thought about the long road it had taken, the humiliation, the separation, the downfall, the rebuilding, the healing. It hadn't been easy, but it had been real. I had found myself not by running from the past, but by coming back and facing it. And as I looked up at the stars, I whispered a quiet thank you for second chances, for family, for love that refuses to die even when everything else falls apart. It was the sound of peace,